Have you ever wondered what happened during those 400 mysterious years between the Old and New Testament? Tonight, I'm going to share with you one of history's most incredible stories that almost nobody talks about anymore. It's a story of ordinary people who changed the course of history forever. Before we walk through the dusty streets of ancient Jerusalem, before we meet the family that would change everything, let me invite you to relax. Close your eyes if you wish. Let the worries of your day begin to fade. Tonight, we travel not just through time, but into the hearts of people who discovered that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to stand anyway. The story we are about to explore takes place in what scholars call the intertestamental period. That might sound complicated, but think of it simply as the space between. Imagine opening your Bible and noticing something curious. The Old Testament ends with the prophet Malachi speaking words of warning and hope. Then you turn the page, and suddenly you are in the Gospel of Matthew, where a baby is born in Bethlehem. Between these two moments lies 400 years, 4 centuries of silence. But was it truly silent? Not at all. During these 400 years, empires rose and fell. Cultures clashed and blended. The Jewish people endured suffering we can scarcely comprehend, yet somehow they persevered. Their faith was tested in fires so hot that many abandoned everything they believed. Yet a faithful remnant remained, keeping alive the promises God had made to Abraham so long ago. What happened during this gap? Why does it matter to us today, thousands of years later, as we seek rest and reflection? Because hidden within this forgotten chapter of history is a family of priests who refused to compromise. A father and his 5 sons who looked at impossible odds and said, "We will not bow." Their name was Maccabees, though they are often called the Maccabees, and their story is one of the most remarkable tales of faith, courage, and sacrifice ever recorded. Tonight, you will meet Mattathias, an old priest whose righteous anger sparked a revolution. You will walk beside his son Judas, nicknamed the Hammer, who led farmers and shepherds against the greatest military machine of the ancient world. You will witness miracles that defy explanation and betrayals that break the heart. You will see the very temple of God defiled by pagan altars, and then watch as faithful hands cleanse it once more. But this is not a simple tale of good versus evil, though those elements are certainly present. As we journey deeper, we will encounter uncomfortable questions. When is violence justified in defense of faith? What happens when religious zeal transforms into political ambition? Can a movement born in purity maintain its holiness when it gains power? These are questions without easy answers, and the Maccabees themselves struggled with them. Their story is also deeply personal. Imagine being a mother in Jerusalem during this time, watching your children grow up in a world where practicing your faith could mean death. Picture a young man torn between the allure of Greek culture, with its philosophy and gymnasiums and promises of advancement, and the ancient covenant his grandparents taught him to treasure. Feel the weight on an elderly priest's shoulders as he realizes he must choose between safety and conviction, knowing his choice will affect everyone he loves. The world the Maccabees inhabited was not so different from ours in many ways. It was a world of pressure to conform, of threats to those who stood out, of powerful forces insisting that old beliefs must yield to modern progress. It was a world where faith seemed outdated and obedience to God appeared foolish. Sound familiar? As you listen tonight, whether you drift into peaceful sleep or remain awake and engaged, I invite you to imagine yourself in their sandals. What would you have done? Would you have hidden your faith to protect your family? Would you have compromised just a little, telling yourself that God would understand? Or would you have found the courage to stand, even if it cost you everything? The Maccabees were not superheroes. They were flawed humans who made mistakes, experienced doubts, and sometimes acted in ways that trouble us even now. Yet through their imperfect lives, God preserved a people and prepared the way for something far greater than military victory. He was preparing the world for a different kind of deliverer, one who would come not with a sword, but with a cross. So breathe deeply once more. Let the cares of this modern world slip away. We are about to step back into history, but this history is alive. It speaks to every generation that faces the choice between comfort and conviction, between assimilation and identity, between bowing to the culture or standing for truth. Our story begins not with battle cries, but with silence. A long, heavy silence that pressed down on the people of God like a weight they could barely carry. Are you ready? Then let us begin. Chapter 2. The Silent Centuries. When heaven seemed closed. Imagine living your entire life without hearing a single word from God. No prophets proclaiming, "Thus says the Lord." No dreams or visions in the night. No writings added to the sacred scrolls your grandparents read in the synagogue. Just silence. Day after day, year after year, generation after generation. 400 years of waiting and wondering if God had forgotten his promises. This was the reality for the Jewish people between the time of Malachi and the birth of Jesus. The prophets who had spoken with such fire and passion, men like Isaiah and Jeremiah, Daniel and Ezekiel, were long dead. Their words were treasured and read repeatedly, but there was nothing new. The heavens seemed closed. Why did God remain silent for so long? This question haunted faithful Jews for centuries, and even today, we do not have a complete answer. Some scholars suggest that God was allowing human history to unfold, setting the stage for the coming Messiah in ways that required this particular sequence of events. Others propose that the silence itself was a test, refining and purifying faith among those who would wait without wavering. Whatever the reason, life during these silent years was anything but quiet. Empires clashed over the small strip of land called Judea, the homeland of the Jewish people. First came the Persians, who had actually been relatively kind to the Jews, allowing them to return from Babylonian exile and rebuild their temple. Under Persian rule, life was tolerable. The Jews could worship their God, follow their laws, and maintain their distinct identity. But Persia's dominance did not last. In 334 BC, a young king from Macedonia began a conquest that would reshape the entire known world. His name was Alexander the Great, and he was only 22 years old when he set out to conquer the Persian Empire. Riding at the head of a relatively small but brilliantly trained army, Alexander won victory after victory. Within just 10 years, he had created an empire stretching from Greece to India, from Egypt to Afghanistan. Alexander was more than a conqueror. He was a student of the philosopher Aristotle, and he carried with him a vision of uniting the world, not just through military might, but through culture. He promoted Hellenization, the spreading of Greek language, Greek customs, Greek philosophy, and Greek religion throughout his empire. Wherever his armies marched, Greek culture followed. Gymnasiums were built, theaters established, and Greek ideas about beauty, wisdom, and the good life took root. For many people in the ancient world, Hellenization was exciting and attractive. Greek art was beautiful, Greek philosophy profound, and Greek culture sophisticated. Greek became the common language of trade and education. Cities that embraced Greek ways prospered. Those that resisted found themselves isolated and viewed as backward. The Jewish people faced a profound dilemma. How much could they participate in this glittering new culture without compromising their covenant with God? Could a Jew appreciate Greek art without worshipping Greek gods? Could Jewish young men attend the gymnasium without participating in rituals that honored pagan deities? Where was the line between cultural exchange and spiritual compromise? These were not abstract theological questions. They tore families apart. A father who insisted on strict observance of the law might watch his son become fascinated with Greek learning and slowly drift away from the synagogue. A young woman who covered her head and dressed modestly according to Jewish custom might feel ashamed when compared to Greek women who moved freely in society. Pressure to conform came from every direction. If you have ever felt pressure to compromise your beliefs to fit in, to stay quiet about your faith, to avoid conflict, or to participate in something that troubles your conscience just to keep the peace, then you understand what the Jews of this period faced. Except their stakes were even higher. They were not just deciding about social comfort. They were wrestling with whether to maintain the covenant that defined their entire identity as a people. Alexander himself was actually somewhat favorable toward the Jews. According to the ancient historian Josephus, when Alexander approached Jerusalem during his conquests, the high priest came out to meet him in full ceremonial garments. Alexander bowed before the priest, explaining that he had seen this figure in a dream before his campaign began. Whether this story is entirely accurate or embellished over time, it reflects the historical reality that Alexander did not force the Jews to abandon their faith. He allowed them to continue their worship and follow their laws. But Alexander died young, at only 32 years old. He had conquered the world, but had no clear plan for who would rule after him. His empire was divided among his generals, leading to decades of warfare. The Jewish homeland became a contested borderland between two of these successor kingdoms, the Ptolemies who ruled Egypt and the Seleucids who ruled Syria. For over a century, Judea was controlled by the Ptolemies. Under their rule, life was reasonably stable. The Jews paid their taxes and were largely left to govern their internal affairs. The high priest served not just as a religious leader, but as the primary representative of the Jewish people to the foreign government. As long as the peace was kept and taxes paid, the Ptolemies did not interfere much with Jewish religion. But around 200 BC, the Seleucid king Antiochus III conquered Judea, taking it from Ptolemaic control. At first, the change seemed positive. Antiochus III actually granted privileges to the Jews, exempting some from taxes and providing funds for temple worship. Jewish leaders hoped for continued tolerance. Those hopes were shattered when Antiochus IV Epiphanes came to power in 175 BC. If Alexander the Great represents Hellenization at its most benevolent, Antiochus Epiphanes represents it at its most brutal. Arrogant and unstable, Antiochus believed himself to be a god manifest on earth. His very name, Epiphanes, means God manifest, though his enemies called him Epimanes, which means madman. Antiochus faced financial troubles and military setbacks. He needed money and unity in his fractured kingdom. He decided that religious uniformity would create political unity, and he had no patience for the peculiar customs of the Jews. Why should one small people refuse to honor the gods that everyone else in his empire worshipped? Their stubborn insistence on worshipping only their invisible God seemed to Antiochus not just strange but dangerous, a challenge to his authority. What happened next was a systematic attempt to destroy Judaism itself. And it is here, in the darkest moment of the silent years, that our story truly begins. Because when faith is forbidden, when worship becomes a crime, when simply being who God called you to be could cost you your life, that is when true character is revealed. Before we continue, let me ask you a question to ponder. Have you ever had to choose between your faith and your safety, between standing for what you believe and going along to get along? The people we are about to meet faced that choice in its most extreme form, and their answer would echo through history. Chapter 3: The Price of Compromise. A nation's soul at stake. If you have been finding comfort in this story, I want you to take another deep breath now. What we are about to discuss is difficult, but it is necessary to understand. Sometimes the most powerful stories are not the easiest ones to hear. They challenge us, even disturb us, and in doing so, they help us see our own lives more clearly. The persecution that Antiochus Epiphanes unleashed upon the Jewish people was methodical and cruel. It began with decrees that seemed almost petty. First, the Sabbath was forbidden. The Jewish people had rested on the seventh day for over 1,000 years, ever since God gave the 10 Commandments to Moses. Now, anyone caught resting on the Sabbath faced punishment. Next came the ban on circumcision. This was perhaps even more significant because circumcision was the sign of the covenant God had made with Abraham. Every Jewish boy was circumcised on the 8th day after birth as a mark of belonging to God's chosen people. Parents who circumcised their sons now faced the death penalty. The sacred scrolls, the Torah, and the writings of the prophets were sought out and destroyed. Soldiers went from town to town, searching homes and synagogues, burning any Hebrew scriptures they found. Merely possessing a copy of the law could lead to execution. Imagine losing access to the Word of God, the stories of your ancestors, the commandments that had guided your people for generations. For the Jews, this was like cutting out their collective heart. But Antiochus was not content merely to forbid Jewish practices. He actively promoted pagan worship in its place. Altars to Zeus and other Greek gods were erected throughout Judea. Jews were commanded to participate in pagan sacrifices. Each town was required to hold monthly celebrations honoring the king's birthday, and these celebrations included offerings to Greek deities. Those who refused faced torture and death. The ancient books of 1st and 2nd Maccabees, which record these events, contain harrowing accounts of martyrdom. Elderly scribes were beaten for refusing to eat pork, forbidden under Jewish dietary laws. Mothers who had circumcised their infants were paraded through the streets with their babies hung around their necks before being thrown from the city walls. Entire families were burned alive for possessing Torah scrolls. One particularly moving account tells of a mother and her 7 sons brought before the king and commanded to eat pork. When the eldest son refused, he was tortured to death while his mother and brothers watched. One by one, each son was given the chance to comply and save his life. One by one, each refused, encouraged by their mother, who told them to remain faithful to the God of their ancestors. Finally, after watching all 7 sons die, the mother herself was killed. Their story became a powerful symbol of faithfulness unto death. These accounts are difficult to hear, especially as we seek peace and rest. Yet they are important because they show us the cost of faithfulness. It is easy to say we believe in God when there is no price to pay. It is far harder when belief costs us everything. But not everyone chose martyrdom. Many Jews, especially among the wealthy and influential, compromised. They reasoned that surely God would understand. Surely external conformity did not matter as long as they still believed in their hearts. Surely protecting their families was more important than stubborn adherence to ancient rules. Some went even further. A group of Jewish leaders approached Antiochus and requested permission to build a gymnasium in Jerusalem. The gymnasium was the center of Greek culture, a place where young men exercised naked, trained for athletic competitions, and absorbed Greek philosophy. For traditional Jews, the gymnasium represented everything opposed to their values. It glorified the physical body rather than spiritual devotion. It was associated with the worship of Greek gods. Its very existence challenged the modesty and separateness that the Torah commanded. Yet influential Jews built this gymnasium in the heart of Jerusalem and encouraged young Jewish men to participate. Some even underwent painful operations to reverse their circumcision, so they would not appear different from Greeks when exercising naked. They were trying to erase the very mark of the covenant from their bodies. Why would they do this? Some genuinely believed that Judaism needed to modernize, to shed what they saw as outdated practices and embrace the sophisticated culture of the Hellenistic world. Others were more cynical, seeing an opportunity for advancement and wealth by aligning with the dominant power. Still, others were simply afraid and thought compromise was the path to survival. This split the Jewish community into factions. On one side were the Hellenizers, those who advocated embracing Greek culture. On the other side were the Hasidim, the pious ones, who insisted on strict observance of the law, no matter the cost. In the middle were the vast majority of ordinary people, trying to navigate between these extremes, wanting to survive, but also not wanting to betray their ancestors. Does this sound at all familiar? In every age, faith communities face pressure to conform to the surrounding culture. In every generation, some argue for adaptation and relevance, while others insist on maintaining tradition and distinctiveness. The arguments of the Hellenizers, that Judaism must change to survive, and the Hasidim, that compromise is betrayal, echo through history into our own time. Then came the ultimate abomination. In December of 167 BC, Antiochus Epiphanes did something that shocked even those Jews who had been willing to compromise. He desecrated the temple in Jerusalem itself. The temple was the heart of Jewish faith, the place where God's presence dwelt among his people. It had been destroyed by the Babylonians centuries earlier, then rebuilt by the returning exiles. It was not as magnificent as Solomon's original temple, but it was sacred, the center of Jewish worship and identity. Antiochus entered the temple and set up an altar to Zeus Olympius. On top of the altar, where sacrifices to the God of Israel had been offered for generations. Then, in an act designed to cause maximum offense, pigs were sacrificed on this altar. Pigs, the most unclean animal according to Jewish law, sacrificed in the most holy place. The temple courts were turned into places of pagan revelry. Prostitutes were brought into the sacred precincts. Everything pure was made profane. The faithful Jews who witnessed this were devastated. The prophet Daniel, writing centuries earlier, had warned of an abomination that causes desolation, and now they were seeing it fulfilled before their eyes. The very center of their faith had been violated. Where could they turn now? If God's own house could be desecrated, what hope remained? It seemed like the end. The silence of heaven continued. No prophet rose to condemn Antiochus. No angel appeared to defend the temple. God's people were scattered, afraid, oppressed. Their faith was outlawed, their scriptures burned, their temple defiled. Many believed that God had abandoned them completely, that the covenant was broken forever. But they were wrong, because in the darkest hour, just when hope seemed completely lost, someone would stand up. Not a great warrior or a wealthy aristocrat, not a prophet or a king, just an old priest in a small village, tired of watching his people suffer, tired of the compromise and the fear. A man who would make a decision in a single moment that would change everything. His name was Mattathias, and his story, the story of the Maccabees, is about to begin in earnest. But first, I want to leave you with a question. We often speak of standing for our faith, but what does that really mean? When is the price too high? Is there a limit to what we should sacrifice for our beliefs? Keep these questions in mind as we continue, because the choices the Maccabees made will force us to wrestle with them. Chapter 4. One man's courage. The spark in Modin. The village of Modin was not particularly important. It sat in the hill country northwest of Jerusalem, a small community of farmers and shepherds. Most of the people who lived there were simple folk, not wealthy or powerful, just trying to survive in increasingly difficult times. If you had visited Modin in early 167 BC, you would have found it much like 100 other villages scattered across Judea, unremarkable and quiet. But sometimes the most important moments in history happen in unremarkable places. Sometimes God uses ordinary people in small towns to accomplish extraordinary things. Modin was about to become the birthplace of a revolution. In this village lived a priest named Mattathias. He came from a distinguished family line, descended from Joarib, one of the priestly divisions established long ago. Mattathias was elderly, his beard more grey than black, his face lined with years of sun and worry. He had 5 sons, each strong and capable: John, Simon, Judas, Eleazar, and Jonathan. Though they were a priestly family, they were not wealthy. They worked with their hands, knew the struggle of daily life, and shared the hardships of their neighbors. Mattathias watched with growing sorrow as the persecution intensified. He heard reports from Jerusalem about the temple's desecration. He saw refugees passing through Modin, families fleeing cities where the persecution was most severe. He witnessed neighbors whispering fearfully about whether they would be forced to participate in pagan sacrifices. The old priest's heart broke for his people, but it was more than sorrow that filled Mattathias. It was also anger, a righteous anger at injustice, at the violation of everything sacred, at the sight of God's people being forced to deny their God. This anger burned in his chest like a coal that would not cool. His sons saw it in his eyes. His neighbors sensed it in his words. Something had to give. The breaking point came on an ordinary day that would become extraordinary. Royal officials arrived in Modin with a decree from the king. All the villagers were to assemble in the town square. An altar had been set up, not to the God of Israel, but to the Greek gods. Every family was required to offer a sacrifice on this altar, publicly demonstrating their loyalty to the king and acceptance of his religious policies. The villagers gathered reluctantly. Fear hung in the air like morning mist. Everyone knew that refusal meant death, but compliance meant betraying everything their ancestors had died to preserve. What would they do? The king's official, a man accustomed to power and obedience, addressed the crowd. His words dripped with false respect as he explained that this was a simple matter of loyalty. Just offer a small sacrifice, burn a bit of incense. It did not mean they had to stop believing in their own God. It was simply a political act, not a religious one. Surely they could see the wisdom in compliance. Then the official turned to Mattathias. He recognized that the old priest was respected in the community. If Mattathias led the way, others would follow. The official offered Mattathias a deal. Sweet with temptation. Go first. Offer the sacrifice. In return, the king would honor him. He would receive silver and gold. He and his sons would be named Friends of the King, a title that brought wealth and protection. All he had to do was perform one small act of obedience. Can you imagine the pressure Mattathias felt in that moment? Every eye in the village was on him. He could save his family. He could spare his neighbors. He could reason that refusing would accomplish nothing except getting people killed. The official made it sound so reasonable, so pragmatic. Just burn a bit of incense. Just say the words. Just bow the knee. Mattathias stood silent for a long moment. Around him, the villagers held their breath. What would their priest do? His 5 sons stood nearby, watching their father, wondering what he would choose. Then Mattathias spoke, and his voice was clear and strong. Even if all the nations in the king's dominions obey him, so that each forsakes the religion of his ancestors and has chosen to follow his commands, yet I and my sons and my brothers will live by the covenant of our ancestors. God forbid that we should forsake the law and the ordinances. We will not obey the words of the king by turning aside from our religion, either to the right or to the left. His words rang out in the square, a declaration of defiance and faith. The official's face darkened. The villagers gasped. To refuse the king's command so openly was to invite certain death. What was the old priest thinking? But before anyone could react, something unexpected happened. A Jewish man from the crowd stepped forward. Perhaps he was afraid for his family. Perhaps he was angry at Mattathias for making things worse with his stubbornness. Perhaps he simply wanted to survive. Whatever his reasons, this man approached the altar, ready to offer the sacrifice that Mattathias had refused. Something snapped inside Mattathias. All the grief and anger he had been carrying, all the sorrow for his people and his God, exploded in a moment of holy rage. This was too much. To see one of his own people, a son of Abraham, willingly desecrating what was sacred, this he could not bear. Mattathias ran forward, in front of the shocked crowd and the royal officials. He struck down the Jewish man who was about to sacrifice. Then he turned and killed the king's officer as well. It was an act of violence, shocking and irrevocable. There could be no going back now. In the stunned silence that followed, Mattathias found his voice again. He shouted words that would echo through the hills and down through history. "Let everyone who is zealous for the law and stands by the covenant come out with me." Then he and his 5 sons tore down the pagan altar with their bare hands. They ran from the village, heading for the wilderness, the hills, and caves where they could hide. And they were not alone. Others followed, men who were tired of compromising, fathers who wanted their sons to know the God of their ancestors, women who refused to raise children in a land where faith was forbidden. The faithful, pious ones, the Hasidim, joined them. This moment raises profound and troubling questions. Was Mattathias right to kill? Could his violence be justified, even in defense of faith? Would God have wanted him to respond with meekness instead, to turn the other cheek? Or was there a time for righteous anger, a moment when standing up required more than words? These are not easy questions, and different people of faith answer them differently. Some point to the Old Testament wars where God commanded Israel to fight. Others point to Jesus' teaching about loving enemies and refusing violence. The story of the Maccabees forces us to wrestle with when, if ever, violence in defense of faith is acceptable. What we can say is that Mattathias believed he had no choice. He could not stand by and watch his people's faith destroyed. He could not bow to idols while the temple lay defiled. Rightly or wrongly, he chose action over passivity, resistance over submission, and his choice sparked a revolt that would shake an empire. In the wilderness, the small band of rebels grew. Mattathias and his sons became guerrilla fighters, striking at the forces of Antiochus and then disappearing into the hills. They destroyed pagan altars in villages throughout Judea. They enforced the law among the people, even forcibly circumcising boys whose parents had been too afraid to do so. They killed Jewish collaborators who were helping the Greek authorities. It was a brutal time. This was not a polite resistance or a peaceful protest. This was an all-out war for survival, and both sides fought with desperation. The rebels faced overwhelming odds. The Seleucid Empire had vast armies, war elephants, professional soldiers, and unlimited resources. The rebels had faith, courage, and knowledge of the terrain. It seemed impossibly unequal, but as the months passed, something remarkable happened. The rebels won victories, small at first, then larger. The Seleucid forces discovered that fighting in the Judean hills against committed guerrillas was far more difficult than they had anticipated. Mattathias's forces struck hard and fast, then melted away before reinforcements could arrive. Yet Mattathias himself would not see the ultimate victory. He was old, and the rigors of life in the wilderness took their toll. As his strength failed, he gathered his sons around him. He gave them his final instructions, and his words reveal what truly motivated this old priest. Mattathias told his sons to be zealous for the law and to give their lives for the covenant of their ancestors. He reminded them of the great men of faith from Israel's past: Abraham, who was tested and found faithful; Joseph, who kept the commandments even in prison; Phinehas, their ancestor, who showed zeal and received an eternal priesthood; Joshua and Caleb, who trusted God's promises; David, who was merciful and inherited a throne forever. These stories were not just history, they were a call to faithfulness, examples that courage and obedience matter. Then Mattathias appointed Judas, his third son, as the military leader of the revolt. He said, "Judas Maccabeus has been strong and mighty from his youth. He shall be the leader of your army and direct the war against the nations." To Simon, his second son, he said, "He is a wise counselor. He shall be a father to you always." With these words, Mattathias died and was buried in Modin, the village where he had made his stand. The people mourned for him greatly. They had lost a leader, a priest, a man who had shown them that faith was worth fighting for. But the story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning, because now Judas Maccabeus, the hammer, would take up his father's cause and lead the Jewish people in a series of battles that would become legendary, victories that seemed impossible, miracles that could not be explained by military strategy alone, a restoration of worship that would be celebrated for thousands of years to come. As we prepare to follow Judas into battle, rest if you need to. Let this story wash over you like a gentle stream. For what comes next is a tale of faith meeting action, of the few standing against the many, of light pushing back darkness. It is the story of what happens when ordinary people decide that some things are worth fighting for. Chapter 5. The hammer rises. Judas and the impossible battles. Judas Maccabeus was not the oldest son, but he was the warrior. From childhood, he had been strong and bold, the kind of young man who others naturally followed. His nickname, Maccabeus, has been interpreted in different ways. Most scholars believe it means the hammer, a name that perfectly captured how he struck his enemies. Others suggest it might be an acronym for the Hebrew phrase, Mi kamocha ba'elim Adonai, which means, "Who is like you among the gods, O Lord?" A cry from the Song of Moses. Either way, the name fit. Judas was both a hammer striking blows for freedom and a man who fought not for himself, but for the God of Israel. When Judas took command of the rebel forces, he faced an overwhelming challenge. His army consisted of farmers, shepherds, and priests, men who knew how to plow fields and tend flocks, not how to fight professional soldiers. They had few weapons, no armor, and no training. They were vastly outnumbered. By any logical calculation, they should have been crushed immediately. But Judas had something that numbers on a page could not measure. He had absolute faith that God would fight for them if they remained faithful. Before every battle, Judas would gather his men and remind them of the great victories in Israel's history. He would tell them about Gideon, who defeated a vast Midianite army with only 300 men. He would recall how David, just a shepherd boy, killed the giant Goliath. He would remind them that their ancestors had walked through the Red Sea on dry ground, while the Egyptian army drowned behind them. These were not just inspiring stories. For Judas and his men, these were proofs that the same God who had delivered their ancestors could deliver them. Their faith was not blind optimism. It was rooted in the character of God, as revealed through centuries of history. The first major battle came at a place called Emmaus. The Seleucid general, Apollonius, led a large, well-equipped force against the rebels. The Greeks had cavalry, heavy infantry, and the confidence that comes from serving the most powerful empire in the region. Judas's men had rough weapons and desperation. Before the battle, Judas gave a speech that reveals his character. According to the ancient accounts, he said, "It is easy for many to be hemmed in by few, for in the sight of heaven there is no difference between saving by many or by few. It is not on the size of the army that victory in battle depends, but strength comes from heaven." Then Judas did something tactically brilliant. Instead of meeting the Greeks in open battle where their superior numbers and equipment would dominate, he used the hill country to his advantage. He struck at night, he ambushed supply lines, he attacked when and where the enemy least expected it. The disciplined Greek formations, so effective on open battlefields, became confused in the narrow valleys and rocky hillsides of Judea. Against all odds, Judas's forces won. Apollonius himself was killed, and his army scattered. Judas took Apollonius's sword and used it in every battle thereafter, a symbol that God could give victory over seemingly invincible enemies. News of this victory spread rapidly. In the Seleucid court, Antiochus was furious. How had a ragtag group of religious fanatics defeated one of his armies? He sent a much larger force under generals Seron, Gorgias, and Nicanor. Surely overwhelming force would crush this rebellion once and for all. But Judas won again and again. Each victory brought more Jews to his side. Men who had been hiding, afraid to resist, now saw that victory was possible. The impossible was happening before their eyes. A faithful remnant was standing against an empire and winning. These battles were not without cost. Many of Judas's men died. The ancient texts do not sugarcoat the brutality of war. Blood soaked the ground. Families mourned sons and fathers who did not return from battle. Even in victory, there was grief. Yet through it all, Judas maintained focus on why they were fighting. This was not about building an empire or gaining personal power. It was about restoring the worship of the God of Israel. It was about making it possible for mothers to circumcise their sons without fear, for families to observe the Sabbath, for priests to offer proper sacrifices. It was about reclaiming what had been stolen, the right to be who God had called them to be. One of the most remarkable aspects of Judas's leadership was his humility. After each victory, he did not claim credit for himself. He pointed to God. He led his men in prayers and thanksgivings. He insisted that they purify themselves before battle, fasting and seeking God's favor. This was not just military strategy. This was spiritual warfare. And Judas understood that faithfulness mattered as much as tactics. The descriptions of these battles in the books of Maccabees sometimes include miraculous elements. Heavenly warriors appearing to fight alongside the Jewish forces, angels striking fear into the hearts of the enemy. Are these literal historical accounts or symbolic ways of expressing that God's intervention made the victories possible? Scholars debate this question. What we can say with certainty is that the people who lived through these events believed God was fighting for them. They saw his hand in every victory. When they should have been defeated, they won. When they should have been wiped out, they survived. Whether through miracle or through courage, through providence or through brilliant strategy, they experienced deliverance. But perhaps the most important battle was not fought with swords at all. It was the battle for Jerusalem and the temple. After several years of fighting, Judas's forces were strong enough to march on the capital city. The Seleucid garrison still held the fortress, the Acra, overlooking the city, and they would continue to hold it for years to come. But Judas was able to enter the Temple Mount area. What he found there broke his heart. The temple courts were overgrown with weeds. The gates had been burned. The priests' chambers were demolished. And inside the sanctuary itself, the horror remained. The pagan altar to Zeus still stood where the altar of God should have been. The holy place was filled with abominations, objects used in pagan worship, evidence of desecration. Judas and his men wept when they saw it. This was not just a building to them. This was the house of God, the place where heaven and earth met, the center of their faith and identity. To see it so violated was almost unbearable, but they did not remain in despair. Judas organized a massive cleansing operation. He chose priests who were blameless in their observance of the law, men who had not compromised during the persecution. These priests purified the sanctuary, removing everything associated with pagan worship. They tore down the defiled altar stone by stone and stored the stones in a safe place until a prophet should arise to tell them what to do with them. This detail is fascinating. It shows their respect for what had once been holy. even though it had been desecrated. They built a new altar according to the specifications given in the law of Moses. They made new holy vessels to replace those that had been stolen or profaned. The lampstand, the altar of incense, the table for the bread of the presence. They hung new curtains and restored the courts. Finally, the moment came for the temple to be rededicated. It was the 25th day of the month of Kislev, exactly 3 years to the day after Antiochus had desecrated it. The symbolism was powerful. What had been destroyed was now restored. What had been defiled was now clean. The darkness was pushed back by light. And it is here that one of the most famous miracles in Jewish history occurred. When the priests went to light the menorah, the great lampstand that was supposed to burn continually in the temple, they discovered a problem. They could find only one small flask of oil, enough for one day. It would take 8 days to prepare new oil, according to the proper ritual requirements. What should they do? They decided to light the menorah anyway, trusting God for provision. And miraculously, that 1 day's worth of oil burned for 8 days, exactly the time needed to prepare more. This miracle became the foundation for the festival of Hanukkah, also called the Feast of Dedication or the Festival of Lights. For 8 days, the Jewish people celebrated with joy. They offered sacrifices, sang hymns of thanksgiving, and praised God for delivering them. The dedication of this restored temple was decreed to be celebrated every year as a perpetual reminder that God preserves his people and his worship. Centuries later, Jesus himself would walk in the temple during the Feast of Dedication. The Gospel of John records, "At that time, the Feast of Dedication took place at Jerusalem. It was winter, and Jesus was walking in the temple." This seemingly small detail connects Jesus directly to the story of the Maccabees. He was participating in a festival that celebrated God's faithfulness to his people in their darkest hour. Soon he would become an even greater light, the light of the world that no darkness could overcome. The story of Judas Maccabeus and the cleansing of the temple is one of the most inspiring accounts of faith in action. It shows us that God can use ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things when they trust him completely. It demonstrates that faithfulness matters, that courage can change history, and that light will always push back darkness if we are willing to let it shine. But as we rest in the glow of this victory, we must also prepare ourselves for what comes next, because the story of the Maccabees does not end with triumph in the temple. It continues through more battles, more struggles, and eventually, difficult questions about what happens when the persecuted become the powerful. The journey is not over yet. Chapter 6. Miracle of Light. The temple restored. There is something deeply moving about light in darkness. A single candle can push back shadows in a room. A lamp can guide travelers through the night. Throughout Scripture, light is associated with God's presence, his truth, and his deliverance. When the menorah in the temple was lit once again, after years of darkness, it was more than just practical illumination. It was a statement that God had not abandoned his people. The 8 days of celebration that followed the temple's rededication were filled with joy, unlike anything the people had experienced in years. Imagine being a Jewish family in Jerusalem during this time. For years, you had hidden your faith, whispered your prayers, taught your children about God in secret. You had watched the temple, the center of your identity, become a place of abomination. You had wondered if God still cared, if his promises still held, if there was any hope for the future. Now, suddenly, everything had changed. You could walk openly to the temple without fear. You could observe the Sabbath in peace. You could circumcise your son without looking over your shoulder for soldiers. The menorah burned brightly in the sanctuary, and priests once again offered sacrifices according to the law of Moses. The sound of psalms and hymns filled the air, instead of the drunken revelry of pagan celebrations. Families came from all over Judea to participate in the dedication. They brought offerings of thanksgiving. They sang the psalms of ascent, the same songs their ancestors had sung when coming to Jerusalem for the great festivals. Children who had never seen the temple functioning properly watched with wide eyes as the ancient rituals were performed. Elderly people wept, remembering a time before the persecution when such worship had been normal. The celebration lasted for 8 days, mirroring the Feast of Tabernacles, one of Israel's most joyful festivals. They carried branches and palm fronds. They sang and danced. They declared that these 8 days should be observed every year by all Jewish people as a reminder of God's faithfulness. But why 8 days? Yes, it matched the length of tabernacles, but there was also the miracle of the oil. That small flask that should have lasted 1 day but burned for 8 became a powerful symbol. It represented how God multiplies the faith of the faithful, how He takes our small offerings and accomplishes far more than we could ask or imagine. How He provides exactly what we need, even when it seems impossible. The miracle of the oil has been debated over the centuries. Some historians point out that the earliest accounts of the temple's rededication do not mention it. The miracle first appears in later rabbinic writings, particularly the Talmud. Does this mean it did not happen? Not necessarily. It might simply mean that the earlier writers focused on other aspects of the story: the military victories, the cleansing of the temple, the restoration of worship. The miracle of the oil might have been so widely known among the people that it did not need to be written down explicitly, or it might have become more prominent in Jewish memory over time as a way to focus the holiday on God's miraculous provision rather than on military victory. Whether the oil burned miraculously or whether the 8 days simply commemorated the time needed to properly rededicate the temple, the meaning remains the same. Hanukkah celebrates light overcoming darkness, faithfulness being rewarded, and the preservation of Jewish identity and worship against impossible odds. The rededication of the temple did not end the conflict with the Seleucids. The wars would continue for years. Judas would fight many more battles. His enemies would not simply accept defeat and leave Judea alone. But something fundamental had shifted. The people of God had their worship back. The covenant had been preserved. Faith had been defended successfully, and God had proven faithful once again. For Christians, this story resonates on multiple levels. We see, in the cleansing of the temple, a foreshadowing of Jesus cleansing the temple during His ministry, driving out the money changers and declaring that God's house should be a house of prayer, not a den of thieves. We see in the miracle of light a preview of Jesus' declaration: "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." We also see an important theological pattern. God preserves His people and His purposes even through the darkest times. The 400 silent years between the Testaments were not truly silent because God was working behind the scenes, preserving the Jewish people, preparing the world for the coming of the Messiah. If the Maccabees had not stood firm, if Jewish worship and identity had been completely erased by Hellenization, there would have been no Jewish context for Jesus to be born into. The genealogies that begin Matthew's Gospel, tracing Jesus back through David to Abraham, would have been lost. The scriptures would have been destroyed. The promises would have seemed void. In a very real sense, the Maccabees helped preserve the environment necessary for the incarnation. They were not perfect. Their later descendants would become corrupt, as we will see. But in their finest moment, they served God's larger purpose, often without even realizing it. This should give us comfort in our own dark times, when we cannot see what God is doing, when heaven seems silent and our faith is tested. God is still at work. He is still preserving. He is still preparing. He is still faithful. The light still burns, even when we can barely see it. The temple that Judas rededicated would stand for another 200 years. Herod the Great would later expand and beautify it, creating the magnificent structure that Jesus knew. It was in this temple that Jesus would be presented as an infant. It was here that he would amaze the teachers with his understanding as a 12-year-old boy. It was from these courts that he would teach and heal. And it was the destruction of this temple, torn down by the Romans in 70 AD, that Jesus would prophesy, saying that not one stone would be left upon another. But even that destruction would not be the end, because the light that the Maccabees fought to preserve was never really about a building or a ritual. It was about the presence of God among his people. And when Jesus came, he became the ultimate temple, the place where humanity meets God. He became the ultimate light that no power on earth could extinguish. They could kill his body, but the light rose again on the third day, and it burns still. As you rest and reflect on this part of the story, consider the lights in your own life. What are the small flames of faith that you guard, even when darkness presses in? What are the practices, the beliefs, the commitments that you maintain, even when it would be easier to let them flicker out? The story of Hanukkah reminds us that maintaining those lights matters, that the small acts of faithfulness accumulate into something much larger than we can see at the time. The Maccabees lit a lamp in the temple, and its light has not gone out for over 2,000 years. Every year, Jewish families around the world light the Hanukkah candles, adding one more each night until 8 burn together. They remember what their ancestors suffered and what they preserved. They teach their children that faith is worth defending and that God provides for those who trust him. And in that ongoing act of remembrance, the light continues to shine. From generation to generation, from darkness to darkness, the flame passes on. It reminds us that we are part of a much larger story, one that began long before us and will continue long after. Our calling is simply to keep the light burning during our watch, to pass it on to the next generation undimmed, and to trust that God will continue to do what he has always done: provide, preserve, and fulfill his purposes. Chapter 7. Brothers in Arms. The continuation of the legacy. The rededication of the temple was a pinnacle moment, a climax in the story of faith's triumph over oppression. But life does not stop at the pinnacle. The battle does not end with one victory. The Maccabees would soon discover that defending freedom is often harder than winning it in the first place. Judas Maccabeus continued to lead the Jewish forces in battle after battle. The Seleucid Empire, humiliated by their defeats, sent army after army to crush the rebellion. Each time, Judas found a way to prevail. He was a brilliant tactician, yes, but those who fought with him believed something more was at work. They believed God was giving them victory because they fought for a righteous cause. Yet war takes its toll, even on the righteous. Judas's brothers fought beside him. Eleazar, known for his courage, died a hero's death in a battle against a Seleucid general named Gorgias. According to the account, Eleazar saw a war elephant that was larger and better equipped than the others. He believed the king himself must be riding it. In an act of extraordinary bravery, or perhaps reckless courage, Eleazar fought his way through enemy soldiers, got under the elephant, and stabbed it from beneath. The elephant fell, crushing Eleazar beneath its massive weight. He gave his life believing he was striking at the enemy king, though it turned out the king was not even in that battle. Eleazar's death illustrates the cost of the Maccabean Revolt. These were not distant figures on a battlefield. They were real men with families who loved them. They were brothers, sons, fathers, and friends. Every victory came with losses that left holes in homes and hearts. Judas himself would eventually fall in battle. In 160 BC, after years of fighting, he faced a Seleucid army at a place called Elassa. His forces were badly outnumbered. Many of his men, seeing the size of the enemy army, deserted Judas was left with only about 800 fighters facing thousands. His remaining men urged him to retreat, to live, to fight another day. But Judas refused. He said, "Let us not leave a stain upon our honor." He charged into battle knowing he would likely die, and he did. The great Judas Maccabeus, the hammer who had won so many impossible victories, fell that day. His death was mourned throughout Judea. The book of 1 Maccabees records, "How is the mighty fallen, the savior of Israel?" His body was recovered and brought back to Modane, where he was buried in the family tomb beside his father Mattathias and his brother Eleazar. For a time, it seemed the revolt might die with Judas. The Seleucids pressed their advantage. Those Jews who had opposed the Maccabees came out of hiding, hoping to regain power and favor. The situation looked desperate, but the Maccabean cause did not die because it had never been about one man. It was about a family, a faith, and a people who had tasted freedom and would not give it up. Judas's youngest brother Jonathan took up leadership of the resistance. Jonathan was different from Judas. Where Judas had been primarily a warrior, Jonathan was also a politician and a diplomat. He understood that military might alone would not secure lasting independence. He began to negotiate, to make alliances, to play the complex political games of the Hellenistic world. The Seleucid Empire was increasingly unstable, with rival claimants fighting for the throne. Jonathan skillfully supported first one side, then another, always extracting concessions for Judea in return. Eventually, Jonathan was appointed high priest, a position that had been vacant or filled by unworthy men during the worst of the persecution. This was a significant moment. The Maccabees were a priestly family, yes, but they were not from the line of Zadok, the family that had traditionally provided high priests. Some faithful Jews were troubled by this appointment. Was it right for the high priesthood to become a political position? Should it be given as a reward for military and political success, rather than based on proper lineage? These questions reveal a tension that would only grow over time. The Maccabees began as pure defenders of faith, but they were becoming political rulers. The distinction between religious authority and political power was blurring. This would have consequences. Jonathan served as both high priest and military leader for many years, expanding Judean territory and influence. He was eventually betrayed and killed by a Seleucid general named Tryphon, who pretended friendship and then murdered him. It was a reminder that the world of power politics is treacherous and brutal. After Jonathan's death, the last of Mattathias's sons, Simon, took leadership. Simon was perhaps the wisest of the brothers. He had served as a counselor to both Judas and Jonathan. Now, as an older man, he would bring the Maccabean cause to its fullest realization. In 142 BC, Simon achieved something remarkable. He negotiated complete independence for Judea. The Seleucid king, desperate for support in his own civil wars, granted the Jews freedom from taxation and recognized their independence. For the first time since the Babylonian exile over 400 years earlier, the Jewish people governed themselves. The people celebrated Simon's achievement by making him high priest and ethnarch, ruler of the nation, not just for his lifetime but for his descendants as well. The Hasmonean dynasty, named after an ancestor of Mattathias, was officially established. Simon's coins were minted. Documents were dated according to his reign. Judea was truly free. Simon used this independence wisely. He fortified cities, secured borders, and promoted trade. He strengthened the temple and encouraged faithful worship. Under his leadership, Judea experienced peace and prosperity. The land that had been torn by war and persecution now flourished. Farmers tended their fields without fear. Merchants traveled safely. Families raised children in stability. The book of 1 Maccabees contains a beautiful passage describing life under Simon. He established peace in the land, and Israel rejoiced with great joy. All the people sat under their own vines and fig trees, and there was none to make them afraid. No one was left in the land to fight them, and the kings were crushed in those days. He gave help to all the humble among his people. He sought out the law and did away with all the renegades and outlaws. He made the sanctuary glorious and added to the vessels of the sanctuary. This description echoes prophecies from the Old Testament about the Messianic age, when everyone would sit under their own vine and fig tree in safety. For a brief, beautiful moment, it seemed as though the promises of God were being fulfilled. The faithful who had stood firm through persecution were rewarded with peace. The covenant was restored, worship was pure, the land was free. But as we will see, even this golden moment carried within it the seeds of future trouble. Because human nature being what it is, success often proves more dangerous than adversity. Persecution purifies faith, but prosperity often corrupts it. The Maccabees had won their freedom, but could they maintain the purity of purpose that had driven them to seek it in the first place? That question will occupy us in the next part of our story. For now, though, rest in this moment of triumph. Imagine the joy of those families sitting under their vines and fig trees, telling their children and grandchildren stories of the dark times, of the persecution, of the brave priests who stood up when everyone else was bowing down. Imagine the pride of knowing that faithfulness had been rewarded, that courage had paid off, that God had delivered his people once again. These moments of peace are precious, all the more so because they are often fleeting. Treasure them when they come, remember them when darkness returns, and know that the God who gave victory to the Maccabees is the same God who watches over you, who promises never to leave or forsake his people, and who always keeps his promises, even when we have to wait 400 years to see them fulfilled. Chapter 8. The weight of the crown, power, and its consequences. Simon's peaceful reign did not last. In 134 BC, he was assassinated by his own son-in-law, a man named Ptolemy, who hoped to seize power for himself. Simon and 2 of his sons were murdered at a banquet, a brutal end for the last of Mattathias's sons, the 5 brothers who had sparked a revolution. But Ptolemy's plot failed. Simon's remaining son, John Hyrcanus, escaped and rallied support. He became the next high priest and ruler, and with him, the Hasmonean dynasty entered a new phase. The generation of the original Maccabees, those who had personally experienced persecution and fought for religious freedom, was gone. Now came descendants who had been born into power. John Hyrcanus was a capable ruler and military commander. He expanded Judea's territory significantly, conquering surrounding regions and forcing many inhabitants to convert to Judaism. This forced conversion is troubling to our modern ears, and it should have troubled people then as well. The Maccabees had fought for the right to practice their own religion freely. Now their descendants were denying that same right to others. The persecuted had become persecutors. Hyrcanus also made an alliance with Rome, the rising power in the Mediterranean world. At the time, this seemed like wise diplomacy. Rome was far away, and an alliance with them provided protection against the weakened but still troublesome Seleucid Empire. Neither Hyrcanus nor anyone else could have foreseen that this invitation to Rome would eventually lead to the complete loss of Jewish independence. After Hyrcanus, the Hasmonean dynasty became increasingly dysfunctional. His son, Aristobulus, declared himself king, the first Hasmonean to take that title. He imprisoned his own mother and brothers and ruled for only a year before dying, possibly from illness, possibly from guilt. The ancient sources suggest he was tormented by having ordered the murder of his brother. The pattern continued with each generation. Brothers fought brothers for power. Rulers murdered family members they saw as threats. The high priesthood, once a sacred office, became a prize to be won through intrigue and violence. Religious devotion gave way to political ambition. One of the most infamous Hasmoneans was Alexander Jannaeus, who ruled from 103 to 76 BC. He was a brutal warrior king who expanded Judea's borders to their greatest extent since the time of Solomon, but who cared little for the religious sensibilities of his people. At one point, while serving as high priest during the Feast of Tabernacles, he deliberately insulted the religious observances, and the people pelted him with fruit. His response was to massacre thousands of them. Later, when a group of his opponents invited the Seleucid king to invade Judea to depose him, Jannaeus brutally crushed the revolt. He crucified 800 of his opponents while they were still alive and forced them to watch as their wives and children were killed before their eyes. Then he celebrated with a feast while the dying men hung on crosses around him. This was a Hasmonean, a descendant of the Maccabees, acting with a cruelty that would have horrified Mattathias and his sons. The dynasty that began with a righteous old priest refusing to bow to idols had devolved into something dark and twisted. The decline of the Hasmoneans raises difficult questions for people of faith. How does this happen? How do movements that start with pure motives become corrupt? How do defenders of the faith become oppressors? Is power itself corrupting? Or is it something in human nature that makes us unable to handle success? History is filled with similar examples. Revival movements that begin in spiritual fire often cool into institutional maintenance within a few generations. Revolutionaries who overthrow tyrants frequently become tyrants themselves. The pattern is so common that it almost seems inevitable, yet it does not have to be. Some leaders maintain their integrity, some movements preserve their original vision. It is possible, but it requires constant vigilance, humility, and a willingness to be accountable. The Hasmoneans also faced a genuine dilemma that is worth considering. Once they had won religious freedom, what then? They were surrounded by hostile neighbors. To survive, they needed political and military power. But engaging in politics and warfare meant making compromises, forming alliances, and sometimes acting in ways that conflicted with their religious ideals. Could they have remained pure and survived, or did survival require them to get their hands dirty? There are no easy answers. We can critique the later Hasmoneans for their brutality and ambition, and we should. But we should also recognize the genuine challenges they faced. The world is complicated. Faith must exist in the real world of competing powers, limited resources, and imperfect choices. By the 1st century BC, the Hasmonean dynasty was tearing itself apart. Two brothers, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, both wanted to be king and high priest. They fought a civil war against each other, with factions of the Jewish people choosing sides. It was a disaster. The dream of the Maccabees, a free and faithful Judea, had become a nightmare of corruption and civil strife. In their desperation, both brothers made a terrible decision. They invited Rome to mediate their dispute. Each hoped the mighty Romans would support his claim and give him victory over his brother. Neither seems to have considered that inviting a foreign power into your affairs usually ends badly. In 63 BC, the Roman general Pompey arrived in Judea. He looked at the situation, saw two squabbling brothers and a divided people, and made a decision. Rome would take control. Pompey entered Jerusalem, and his soldiers captured the Temple Mount. According to the historian Josephus, Pompey even entered the Holy of Holies, the most sacred place in the temple, where only the high priest was allowed to go once a year. He found it empty. No statue, no image, nothing but an empty room. He was apparently puzzled by this. How could a place so sacred contain nothing physical? But for the Jews watching, his violation was almost as devastating as what Antiochus Epiphanes had done 2 centuries earlier. Judea was now under Roman domination. The Hasmonean dynasty would limp along for a few more decades in diminished form. but real power belonged to Rome. The independence that Simon Maccabeus had won and celebrated was gone. The people of God were once again under foreign rule. This is the tragic end of the Maccabean story. It began with a priest in a small village refusing to bow to idols. It rose to incredible military victories against impossible odds. It peaked with the rededication of the temple and the restoration of Jewish independence, and it declined into corruption, civil war, and ultimately the loss of everything the original Maccabees had fought for. Yet even this dark ending is not meaningless. It teaches us something important. It reminds us that earthly victories are temporary, that political freedom, while precious, is not the ultimate goal, that the real battle is always spiritual, not physical, and that human institutions, no matter how righteous their beginnings, will inevitably fail us in the end. The Maccabees preserved Jewish faith and identity during a critical period. They kept alive the worship of the one true God when it was under existential threat. They maintained the covenant through the silent centuries, and in doing so, they prepared the way for something infinitely greater than a dynasty or a kingdom. They prepared the way for a Messiah. As we move toward the conclusion of our story, take a moment to reflect. What do we do with success when we achieve it? How do we stay faithful when persecution ends and prosperity begins? How do we avoid the corruption that power seems to bring? These are not just ancient questions. They are questions every generation, every institution, every individual who experiences success must face. The Maccabees give us both inspiration and warning. Their courage inspires us. Their faith strengthens us. Their victories encourage us. But their decline warns us. It reminds us that the end of the story matters as much as the beginning. It challenges us to finish well, to maintain integrity when it would be easier to compromise, and to remember that our true citizenship is not in any earthly kingdom, but in the kingdom of God. Chapter 9, the slow fade. When zeal becomes ambition. There is a particular sadness in watching something beautiful decay. A garden that was once carefully tended, becoming overgrown with weeds. A building that was once magnificent, slowly crumbling. A movement that was once pure, gradually losing its way. The decline of the Hasmonean dynasty carries this kind of sadness. What went wrong? When did the shift happen? At what point did the descendants of Mattathias stop being guardians of the faith and become just another power-hungry dynasty? These questions do not have simple answers, because change rarely happens all at once. It is usually a slow fade, a series of small compromises and subtle shifts that accumulate over time, until one day you look around and realize you have lost your way. Perhaps the seeds of decline were present from the beginning. Even Mattathias, in his righteous anger, used violence. Even Judas, for all his faith, was a warrior who killed many. Even Simon, the wisest of the brothers, accepted political power along with religious authority. None of these things are necessarily wrong. Sometimes righteousness requires force. Sometimes leadership requires difficult decisions. But they open doors that are hard to close later. When Jonathan accepted the position of high priest from a Seleucid king, it established a precedent. The high priesthood could be a political appointment. When Simon's descendants made the position hereditary, it transformed from a sacred office into a family possession. When later Hasmoneans began calling themselves kings, they were claiming a status that, according to Jewish tradition, belonged only to the line of David. Step by step, the exceptional became normal, the temporary became permanent, the means became the end. The religious parties that emerged during this period reflect the tensions within Jewish society. The Pharisees, whose name means the separated ones, emphasized strict observance of the law and were often critical of the Hasmonean rulers for their compromises and corruption. The Sadducees, largely drawn from the priestly and aristocratic classes, tended to support the Hasmoneans and were more willing to accommodate Greek culture. The Essenes, disgusted by what they saw as the temple's corruption, withdrew to the desert to live in isolated, pure communities. These divisions would still be present when Jesus began his ministry. The Pharisees and Sadducees that we read about in the Gospels were, in part, products of the Maccabean and Hasmonean period. Their debates about how to be faithful Jews in a Hellenistic world, how to maintain identity while living under foreign rule, and what compromises were acceptable, were shaped by the experiences of the previous 2 centuries. By the time Rome took control, many Jews were exhausted. Decades of civil war, brutal rulers, and religious corruption had taken their toll. Some welcomed Roman order, hoping it would bring stability even at the cost of independence. Others seethed with resentment, longing for another Judas Maccabeus to rise up and drive out the foreigners. Still, others withdrew from public life entirely, focusing on personal piety and waiting for God to intervene. Into this complicated, messy, disappointing situation, a child would be born in Bethlehem. But before we get there, we need to understand one more aspect of the Maccabean legacy, the memory itself. Even as the Hasmonean dynasty declined, the story of the original Maccabees grew in power and influence. The tale of Mattathias refusing to sacrifice, of Judas winning impossible battles, of the temple being cleansed, and the oil burning miraculously. These stories were told and retold. They were written down in the books of Maccabees. They were celebrated every year at Hanukkah. They became part of Jewish identity. For Jews living under Roman occupation, the Maccabees represented hope. They proved that resistance was possible, that God could give victory to a faithful remnant, that foreign powers could be defeated. This hope would fuel several revolts against Rome in the coming centuries, most notably the Great Revolt of 66 to 73 AD, which would result in the destruction of the temple, and the Bar Kokhba Revolt of 132 to 135 AD, which would be brutally crushed. Were these later revolutionaries right to invoke the Maccabean example, or were they misunderstanding the lesson? The Maccabees fought for religious freedom when their faith was being outlawed. But Rome, for all its faults, generally allowed Jews to practice their religion. The later revolts were driven more by political nationalism and resentment of foreign rule than by the kind of religious persecution Antiochus had imposed. They ended in catastrophic defeat and immense suffering. This raises an uncomfortable question. Can a righteous cause in one context become a dangerous precedent in another? The Maccabees were right to resist Antiochus's attempt to destroy Judaism. But does that mean armed revolt is always the right response to foreign rule? Where is the line between faithful resistance and foolish rebellion? These are not just historical questions. People of faith in every age face similar dilemmas. When should we resist the culture around us? And when should we accommodate? When is compromise wise? And when is it betrayal? When should we fight? And when should we submit? The story of the Maccabees and their descendants does not give us easy formulas, but it does give us examples to wrestle with. What we can say clearly is this: the original Maccabees succeeded not just because they fought, but because they fought for something sacred and in a context where God's covenant was under direct threat. Their victories were miraculous precisely because they were impossible by human standards. They won not through superior force, but through faith and divine intervention. When later generations tried to replicate their military success through human strength and political maneuvering, without that same purity of purpose and dependence on God, they failed. The decline of the Hasmoneans also reminds us that no earthly kingdom lasts forever. Every dynasty falls, every empire crumbles. Every movement that begins in spiritual fire eventually cools. This is not pessimism, it is realism. It is also why we should not put our ultimate hope in political movements or human institutions, even good ones. The Maccabees preserved the faith for a season, and that was crucial. But they could not establish the eternal kingdom. That would require a different kind of deliverer, one who would not come with a sword, but with a message of grace, one whose kingdom would not be of this world, one who would defeat death itself, rather than merely human enemies. As the Hasmonean dynasty faded into history, as Rome consolidated its grip on Judea, as faithful Jews waited and wondered if God would send another deliverer like Judas Maccabeus, God was preparing something far greater than anyone imagined. Not a warrior to cleanse the temple, but a Messiah to cleanse hearts. Not a political kingdom, but an eternal one. Not a victory over Greeks or Romans, but a victory over sin and death. The stage was set, the promises were preserved, the people were waiting, and in the fullness of time, as Paul would later write, God sent forth his Son. The real light that the menorah had symbolized was about to enter the world, and that light would never go out. Chapter 10. Echoes through time. The legacy that never dies. As our journey through the story of the Maccabees comes to a close, let us take a few moments to reflect on what this ancient tale means for us today. Why does this story, over 2,000 years old, still matter? What lessons can we draw from the courage and the failures of this priestly family? First and most obviously, the Maccabees remind us that faithfulness matters. When Mattathias stood in the town square of Modin and refused to offer sacrifice to false gods, he made a choice that seemed small in the moment, but had enormous consequences. One old man saying no changed the course of history. He did not know that his stand would spark a revolution, cleanse the temple, or preserve Judaism through one of its darkest periods. He simply knew he could not betray his God, and he acted on that conviction. How often do we face similar moments on a smaller scale? Moments when we must choose between convenience and conviction, between fitting in and standing out, between compromising and remaining faithful. We rarely know in the moment how significant our choices will be. But the story of the Maccabees assures us that faithfulness in small things matters to God and can have ripple effects beyond what we can imagine. Second, the Maccabees show us that God can use ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things. Mattathias was not a king or a general. Judas was not a trained warrior. They were priests and farmers who found themselves in an impossible situation and chose to trust God rather than accept defeat. Their victories came not from superior force, but from faith and courage. This is a pattern we see throughout Scripture, from Gideon's 300 defeating the Midianites, to David facing Goliath, to the apostles turning the Roman world upside down. God delights in using the weak and ordinary to accomplish his purposes, so that it is clear the power comes from him, not from us. Third, the preservation of Jewish faith and identity during the Maccabean period was essential for the coming of Jesus Christ. If Antiochus had succeeded in eradicating Judaism, if the temple had remained defiled and worship had ceased, if the scriptures had been destroyed and the covenant forgotten, there would have been no context for the Messiah. The promises God made to Abraham, repeated to David, and proclaimed by the prophets would have seemed to disappear into the silence of history. But they did not disappear because faithful people like the Maccabees refused to let them. They guarded the flame through the darkness. They preserved the story. They maintained the worship. They kept alive the hope that God would one day send a deliverer. And when that deliverer came, when Jesus was born in Bethlehem, he entered a world where the promises were still known, where the scriptures were still read, where the faithful were still waiting. In this sense, the Maccabees were precursors to Jesus. They prepared the way, not by announcing him like John the Baptist would, but by preserving the faith he would fulfill. The temple they cleansed would be the temple where Jesus taught. The feast of dedication they established would be a feast Jesus observed. The hope they kept alive would be the hope Jesus satisfied. Yet fourth, and this is crucial, the Maccabees also show us the limitations of earthly solutions. They won military victories, but those victories did not bring lasting peace. They gained political independence, but it did not last. They cleansed the temple, but it would be defiled again and eventually destroyed. Their dynasty began in purity, but ended in corruption. Even the best human efforts ultimately fall short. This is not a criticism of the Maccabees, but a recognition of reality. No earthly kingdom lasts forever. No human institution remains pure indefinitely. No political solution addresses the deepest problems of the human heart. The Maccabees did what they could, and it mattered, but it was not enough. Something more was needed. Someone more was needed, and that someone came. Jesus Christ, the true light of the world, arrived in the fullness of time. He would teach in the temple the Maccabees preserved. He would fulfill the law they fought to defend, but he would also transcend everything they accomplished. He would not just cleanse a building, but offer to cleanse every heart. He would not just defeat human enemies, but conquer sin and death. He would not establish a temporary kingdom, but announce an eternal one. When Jesus walked in the temple during the Feast of Dedication, as John's Gospel records, he was walking in a space made possible by the Maccabees' courage, but he was also revealing himself as something greater than the Maccabees. They had been deliverers for a season. He was the deliverer for all time. They had rekindled a lamp. He was the light itself. The story of the Maccabees also challenges us to think carefully about the relationship between faith and power, between spiritual devotion and political action. The early Maccabees show us that sometimes faith requires resistance, that there are moments when we must stand against evil, even at great cost. But the later Hasmoneans show us that power corrupts, that success can be more dangerous than persecution, and that mixing religious authority with political ambition often ends badly. How do we navigate these tensions in our own time? How do we engage with the world and its power structures without being compromised by them? How do we work for justice and defend the vulnerable without becoming oppressors ourselves? These are questions without easy answers, but they are questions we must continually ask. Perhaps the most important legacy of the Maccabees is simply this: they teach us that dark times are not the end. When it seems like evil has won, when the temple is defiled and the faithful are scattered, when heaven seems silent and hope seems foolish, God is still at work. He is still faithful. He still preserves a remnant. He still accomplishes his purposes. The 400 silent years between the Testaments were not truly silent because God was preparing. The persecution under Antiochus was not the end because God raised up deliverers. The corruption of the Hasmoneans was not the final word because God sent his Son. Again and again, just when things seem darkest, just when all seems lost, God acts. This should give us hope in our own dark times. When our faith is tested, when culture pressures us to compromise, when we feel like a small remnant holding on to beliefs the world considers outdated, we can remember the Maccabees. We can remember that God honors faithfulness, that courage matters, that small acts of obedience can have consequences far beyond what we see, and that God's purposes will prevail even when we cannot imagine how. As you drift towards sleep or continue to reflect on this story, I want to leave you with one final thought. The light that Judas Maccabeus lit in the temple, that miraculous flame that burned for 8 days, was always meant to point beyond itself. It pointed toward a greater light, a light that would come into the world and that darkness could never overcome. That light has come. Jesus Christ, the light of the world, has risen. He still shines today, and just as the Maccabees guarded the flame of faith through their generation, we are called to guard it through ours. We are called to be faithful, to stand for truth, to resist compromise, and to trust that God is still at work, even when we cannot see it. The story of the Maccabees is not just ancient history. It is a living testimony that echoes through time, reminding every generation that faith matters, courage counts, and God never abandons his people. Their fire burns still, passed from hand to hand, from heart to heart, until the day when we no longer need lamps or candles or menorahs, because we will see the true light face to face. Until that day, may we be faithful, may we be courageous, may we guard the flame, and may we always remember that the same God who strengthened Mattathias and his sons, who gave victory to Judas, who preserved his people through the silent centuries, is the same God who watches over us, who loves us, who will never leave us or forsake us, and who has promised that his purposes will prevail. The Maccabees fought for the faith. We are called to live it. They preserved the promises. We are called to proclaim their fulfillment. They guarded the light. We are called to let it shine. And in doing so, we become part of the same great story, the story of God's faithfulness to his people through every age, every trial, every darkness, until at last we reach the eternal light. Thank you for journeying with me through this remarkable story. May it strengthen your faith, encourage your heart, and remind you that you are part of something far greater than yourself. You are part of God's eternal purpose, and that purpose cannot fail. Sleep well, or reflect peacefully, knowing that the God of the Maccabees is your God, and his light still shines. If this story has moved you, if it has given you something valuable, I encourage you to share it with others who might need to hear it. Subscribe to this channel so you can continue exploring these deep stories of faith and history. Like this video if it blessed you, and most importantly, live out the lessons we have learned. Be faithful, be courageous, guard the flame, and trust that God is still at work, still faithful, still accomplishing his purposes, even now. God bless you. May the light of his presence go with you, and may you always remember that even in the darkest times, the flame of faith burns on. Amen.